Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this very early morning session of FedCASIC. Our session today is leveraging data science to improve data quality. And I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping first and foremost before we get into our presentations. So we are recording and these will be posted. So if you don't want to be recorded and don't want to be part of the recording, you can leave and watch it later if you would like, but we are recording, so we want you to know that. Also during the presentations, if you have questions, you can post them in the chat, and we're going to hold all the questions until the end. But if you have a question, go ahead and post it and we'll make sure to get back to you. Or during the question and your hand and ask your question yourself, but we'll hold those all till the end. So we're going to go ahead and just dive right in and start with our very first speaker. So Graham, you want to go ahead and get your presentation up?
Sure, will do. Thanks, Renee. All right, and you can see my slides and not seeing slide notes.
I am not seeing slides at this point.
Still no slide?
Still no slide.
All right, then.
Oh, there. We see them now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And they're correct. They're not slide notes.
Okay, good. All right, thanks so much. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks again, everyone, for coming out this morning. Appreciate your attention onto our session this early. So I'll be discussing a recent examination of Paradata and its use in assessing respondent behavior and data quality in the Consumer Expenditure Online Diary Survey. And before I get started, I'd like to thank my co-author, Parvati Krishnamurti, for all of her help on this analysis. Here's a quick look at our presentation agenda. We'll just get started with an overview of Paradata and our CE Online Diary before we get into our analysis results and next steps. And we'll just start with a basic question. So what are Paradata? And many of you are probably familiar with this concept already, but for those who are not, Paradata are data about the process by which survey data were collected and are generally generated as a byproduct of the survey's data collection process. But the analysis of this byproduct can be incredibly helpful for survey programs, as methods research have shown that understanding these data can lead to improved data collection efficiency, reduced survey fielding cost, and just a better understanding of measurement error. And these Paradata have recently become a topic of increased interest in our CE program following the introduction of an online expenditure diary. And the online diary serves as a supplemental mode to our traditional paper form diary, which is still used by the majority of our respondents for logging their expense information. But it's been pretty well received so far and accounts for about 28% of all CE diaries in our most recently available quarter of data. But its actual introduction, you can see in this graphic kind of timeline from left to right, starting, of course, with the development, which was part of a larger effort to redesign our CE surveys, and included towards the end a large-scale feasibility test of the online diaries that was fielded at the end of 2019 through April 2020, excuse me. And this third step C didn't really originally plan for in our online diary introduction, but in response to the Census Bureau's temporary halt on in-person visits during the early months of the pandemic, the Bureau of Labor Statistics made this online diary version available starting in June of 2020 to assist with data collection efforts. And it remained in use until our official date of introducing the online diary into CE diary survey production, which was not until this last phase in July of 2022. And while this was not the ideal circumstances for a rollout of a new survey product, this emergency use period did afford our program an opportunity to analyze the resulting Paradata from this emergency use period, which covered all of 2021, which is what we'll be looking at today. In the specific case of our CE Online Diary Paradata, these data contain information on our survey respondents, or users as they be called some throughout this presentation, and their activity within the diary instrument. And these user actions are recorded as Paradata events, and along with relevant details in tabular form. Each event is recorded as its own row, and each is given a timestamp and then a value describing the type of event. You can see some of these examples here, like logins, failed logins, entry, hyperlink, all that good stuff. It has an actual look at what it looks like. So you can see each row is given a type, timestamp, and sorted chronologically. And of course, any sensitive information was scrubbed from this example. This is just a kind of a look at the structure. So now we've established the background of Paradata in CE. We'll move on to our analysis results, covering the topics shown here, beginning with diary use and logins. And our examination of the 2021 Paradata in CE revealed that information was recorded for 1,877 unique consumer units, or CUs, over the course of the year. And of those, 1,801 successfully logged into the online diary instrument at least once. And this left 76 that either never successfully logged in or didn't even attempt to, despite being placed with online diary credentials. In this slide, we display the login activity in two overlapping groups. First, all those with successful logins, like we mentioned, and then those with successful logins as well as login failures. And this larger bubble represents that group that had at least one successful login, and they accounted for 22,100 logins over the course of the year, with an average of 12.3 per user and a median of 10 per user. And then the smaller subset bubble contains those consumer units with a successful login, but also login failure. And they were associated with about 3,160 login failures with an average of 5.42 and a median of 4 per user. And this left about 2/3 of that larger group that had a successful login, but never had any login failure. So we see it was kind of contained to 1/3 of that larger group. This next graph gives a more detailed look at login activity by combining Paradata with diary day information. And we're able to assess the percentage of logins occurring on each diary day of the diary keeping period. And the graph shows that most of the login activity, which is shown by the blue line, was concentrated around the beginning and end of the diary keeping period, with a small bump, around day 8, presumably due to the midweek reminder contact from the census field representative. We can also see that day 0, which is the diary placement day, had the highest proportion of logins throughout the week, with about 10.4. This wasn't really unexpected, as this is when the field rep working the case places the diary and typically helps the respondent log in for the first time. So that's likely what we're capturing there. And for day 1 and 2, logins remained relatively high compared to the rest of the week, and it's kind of started to taper off again, that day 8 bump. And then they remained relatively low until day 14, when they jumped back above 7%. We think this late bump in logins may have been due to last-minute data entry or going through with the field rep in the pickup interview, adding more expenses. We see in the orange, login failure followed a similar trend as far as like peaking on the day 0 and then falling over the course of the diary keeping period. But we don't really see as much of a rise again in the second week. We presume this would be due to people saving their passwords in browsers and just generally getting more comfortable with logging in. So in addition to these login user actions, our Paradata also captured user environment data describing how online diary webpage was accessed by our users when they logged in. And this environment data includes screen sizes and operating systems to view the web page, and this can in turn be used to look at the type of device used by the respondent. And for the purpose of our analysis, device use was broken down into 3 categories: desktop only, mobile only, and mixed device use. And a CU was determined to be a mixed device use if they had login events in our Paradata that were associated with more than one type. So basically they had a mobile login and a desktop login over the 2 weeks. And the information on the slide shows that desktop only use was by far the most popular option in 2021, with 64.5% of CUs, followed by mobile only and mixed device use with 21.5% and 14% respectively. And device information is also useful for grouping other findings like the previously mentioned logins. And the data in this graph showed that for both mean and median estimates of logins, CUs with mixed device use on the far right logged into their diary more frequently than desktop or mobile users. In this next section, we'll look at time spent in the diary, which examines the average total time online diary users spent in the instrument. And for this study, total time spent was calculated by summing the difference between the chronologically sorted actions in the Paradata and then dividing that total by 60 to get a total in minutes. And this method did require some specific tailoring because we wanted to get at time spent on diary keeping activities and not just total time logged into the instrument. So to accomplish this, time differences between certain actions like the ones highlighted below or in this slide are restricted from the total time summation. And these So after we actually put these restrictions into place, it cut down on the number of CUs we could look at, and we had 1,606 left from the original 1,801 that had sufficient activity for a time to be calculated. And we can see here that online diaries in 2021 had a mean average of 33.5 minutes and a median of 24.2. And after estimating the overall time for diary users in 21, we again use the device type information to split the users up. And the results show that on average, desktop only users shown at the top spent the most total time in the diary with a mean of 36.7 and a median of 27.5 minutes. And mixed users shown at the bottom trailed desktop only users by only about a minute in both the mean and median estimates of total time. But we see in the middle, mobile only users lagged both by a considerable amount. And you can see that the mean for that category was 19.7 minutes and the median all the way down to 10.3. So yeah, significantly less than the other two groups. And finally, to conclude the time and diary section, we look at median time spent per diary day. And it should be noted that we didn't count instances where a user had 0 time on a day. So if they had, like for day 5, if they didn't have any time, it wouldn't be counted towards the median estimate. But we can see from this graph that the final days of the diary keeping period ended up with the most time spent. And again, we believe this is likely due to respondents kind of loading their expenditure entry work towards the end of the diary keeping period. Now, this concludes the time and diary section, and now I'll move on to the Paradata's relation to data quality. And to better understand a bit smaller because we again restricted to only complete cases as opposed to all those with online diary credentials. And first, we look at median total expenditures and expenditure counts in 2021 by the number of logins, and we cut the two groups by the median point. So those with 10.5 or greater logins were in the high group, and those less were in the relatively low group. And we see that in the higher group, the median total expenditures and counts were a good bit higher. And when we look on the next slide, we see this same cut, but now we're looking at device types. And we see that desktop only and mixed device users were only separated by about $4 in median expenditure totals and one entry count, while the mobile only users lagged both groups by over $155 in total expenditures and roughly six expenditure counts. And this wasn't really surprising as desktop only and mixed device users were associated with higher login activity in previous slides. And finally, we looked at the same thing by time spent using a similar method to login for the split. And all CUs with a time total in the diary greater than or equal to 27 were sorted into the high group, and those with less than 27 into the relatively low group. And this comparison shows that the estimates for median expenditure totals and counts were much higher among those with relatively greater time spent in the diary, about $474 higher and 20 entries higher. So that wraps things up for our results. Now under our conclusions and next steps. So I think the first takeaway is more of a confirmation from this research, which is that the analysis of Paradata really can increase our program's ability to measure diary respondent behavior. It allows us to access data on a more granular level that we weren't able to look at before, give us new angles to analyze from, like time spent in logins that we wouldn't have had access to in the paper form. One of the second things is we kind of initially expected time spent in the diary and total logins were associated with higher expenditure totals and counts. And this showed that Paradata not only offered new information, but meaningful insights to the data quality and CE. And we also found that device information was fairly useful and seems to indicate that respondents who incorporate non-mobile devices, or in other words, desktops, into their diary keeping tend to be associated with better quality outcomes for their diaries. And for next steps, first, we'd want to recommend that average total logins per user and total time spent in the diary be incorporated into our CE data quality profile as standard metrics for monitoring quality. We also want to keep working on time spent in the diary to continue to tweak it to get the most precise estimate for time spent on diary keeping activities. We can clean that up by addressing and reevaluating some of our naming conventions in the Paradata. And we'd also, with respect to field procedures, we would like to potentially use some of this information on user or device types to kind of sort into the better sorting of respondents for who gets the online diary potentially. Not everyone can use a desktop, but perhaps the inclusion of a question at the end on if they had a device other than their phone to fill out the diary with could improve our placement. But I think that wraps things up for me. Here's my contact information, and I look forward to any questions at the end of the session. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Graham. That was great. I'm really excited to ask you questions at the end because data is my thing. But for now, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next speaker. So Francis, are you or Isa going to present? Francis. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see your slides.
Okay, excellent. So I will kick us off, and then Francis will take over. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity, and for all of y'all to be here. So my name is Isa Aboud. I work with the Federal Acquisition Service at GSA. I'm here with Francis Smart from Sensei Consulting. Today, we will be talking about how we handle large volumes of transactional sales data. Please keep in mind that nothing we say here is intended to suggest that the General Services Administration endorses this approach as a best practice for every situation. Instead, the methodology we use in the solution presented here is a tactical approach to an existing business strategy. Okay, so to give you context, GSA's mission directly addresses acquisitions, which means contracts between contractors and the government, as well as sales data. In order to support this mission, we tend to use innovative solutions of different kinds. So for this application here, we're talking about large sales data that would help us assess purchaser discounts, as well as price patterns and trends over time. Okay. So before we start talking about data, its challenges, and our approach to overcome those challenges, I want to explain some of the practices at GSA that strategically drive us to build this infrastructure around the data. So for the purpose of our discussion, think of FAS as the entity that brings together contractors and federal agencies, where on the one hand, the contractors are the suppliers of products and services, and the government is the consumer of those products and services. The Federal Acquisition Service does many things to make this partnership between government and contractor efficient, effective, and mutually beneficial. But to stay on topic, I will only talk about the goals behind establishing a contract relationship with a private company and the data that we collect as a result of this arrangement. Okay, so first, as you see on the screen, we leverage big government purchasing power. This does not mean that we want to overpay whenever we buy stuff. On the contrary, here we leverage the fact that the federal agencies are the biggest consumers of goods and services in the world. So, as an example, instead of a single agency buying 100 laptops for one of its offices and trying to get some discount from the manufacturer, think of the added leverage we can have when negotiating discounts if the contractor expects to sell tens of thousands of laptops over the life of a government-wide contract. Not only will that manufacturer be willing to offer deep discounts, competitors in the marketplace with similar products or services will come to the table and try to offer better deals to the government. It is really a win-win for both government and contractor. The contractor has a higher return on investment because they have a steady, consistent consumer, and the government can fulfill its needs with high quality products and services at a low cost. Okay, so let's talk about the contract or the agreement between contractor and government. Typically, before a contractor is onboarded, they are supposed to prove that they are treating the government as the most favored customer. So I don't want to go too much into detail for that, but usually there's a couple of deliverables, maybe actually more than a couple, generally referred to as the price reduction clause. But the contractor has the burden, really, to prove that they are treating the government as the most favored customer. Okay, contractors sometimes complain about that burden, but then at the end of the day, they do it because they want to be on contract. So what happens is, the contractor supplies that, proves that they are treating us as most favored customer, and then we, on the government side, gets the best price for high quality products and services. Okay. Now, in addition to that, the contractor provides sales data. Okay, that's usually like an invoice type of report where it shows you maybe 1 or 2 line items saying we sold the government a bunch of stuff, right? Or we provided service. So maybe, computer equipment for $1 million. And that would also be reported to the government at GSA. Okay, so now here, the way we handle that is we could and we do conduct vendor audits, right? But the audits are very difficult. They are very time consuming because how do we find pricing? We are receiving a single line item that says computer products for like a large dollar value. Okay. Now the contractor could go back if they're being audited and pull the detailed transactional data. But if the audit is happening 2-3 years after the fact, that could be very problematic, especially for small business. Okay. So you can imagine thousands of vendors. Okay. Probably hundreds of thousands of contracts, right, and multiple reporting systems. So that could be very very challenging. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So even if we are doing this and we have a system in place where we can do these audits, okay, it's we don't have enough manpower to audit every single transaction or every single contract, so to speak. So we're just basically skimming the tip of the iceberg when that happens. So maybe we can try something else, right? About in 2016, someone came up with the idea and said, let's think of another win-win situation. Instead of the contractor providing this deliverable that proves they're treating us as the most favored customer, instead of that, let us tell them not to provide that. So we give them a waiver. They don't have to do that. But in return, they provide us the transactional data, which means they give us specific line items, a specific line item for every product or service that they sell. 9 times out of 10, the contractor has that already. They might dispose of it after some time, but at least when they sell the product or the service to the government, they would have that transactional data. So they have it anyways, they give it to us. And then on our side, on the government side, we can do price analysis, right? We can check the price and we can determine on our side whether or not they're treating us as a most favored customer. We can do vendor analysis, and we can do contract analysis because we now have that large amount of data. Now, the caveat here, or the point that you need to make, is that the transactional data, because of the format that we're receiving it, we will be receiving a lot more data than we did before this model. So on the government side, it adds a little bit more work, but it gives us the power to do the analysis on our side. The other point is that transactional data has got to be at a certain level of quality so that we can actually do this analysis. And then we can make informed decisions based on it. So before I turn it over to Francis, one of the challenges is to make sure that that data, the large amount of data, we're talking millions and millions of rows of transactional data, has to be at a certain level of quality. And then now I'll turn it over to Francis to talk about how we handle it and how we ensure quality.
Yeah, thank you for letting me talk. Sorry, thanks for letting us have this presentation space. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing how to turn on the camera once I've already started sharing, so I probably should have figured that out previously. So when we're looking at transactional data, we'll refer to it as TDR moving forward. The TDR is a parsimonious database with only 11 required fields. So it's parsimonious because we want it to be the least burdensome to vendors, and since its inception in 2017, number of vendors in this program has gone from 1,700 to 2,900 with a 10% average growth over the time period. The number of transactions has gone from 1 million annually to 4 million with a 39% overall growth. And the total value has gone from 2.5 billion to 14 billion with a 47% total growth. That's so far the TDR database has over 20 million transactions. So this is as of 2023 and over $55 in value. So how are we going to make sense of this data? The data has many common problems, which are common with other large data. And we can break the problems down into storage. So
I think we lost your audio.
Process as like a transient cluster, which pulls up resources on a daily basis, and then does the computation on those. And what's important for the data perspective is that vendors can go in and edit data from years previously as well, and that does happen. And so we have to reprocess all the data on a daily basis. In terms of data dissemination, the data, once it's been processed, it's duplicated on Redshift so that other departments or agencies could potentially access the data, assuming that they sign all the NDAs and everything appropriate. And then there's, for the data pipeline monitoring, we have it integrated with Google Sheets, and it produces a daily report every time it's run. And finally, we also have periodic PDF reports, which are generated, and we use these to reach out to vendors and to communicate with them about potential issues that is in their data or with their submission process. I just want to mention that even though we use these particular technologies, we're not necessarily saying that they're better than alternative technologies. So when we get into the computation, our analytical tasks are broken down into identifying the correct products and to verify that they are priced competitively. Sounds simple, right? Only GSA catalog of items has 56 million products. Many items duplicate across vendors with slightly different product numbers or descriptions, and many products are customizations. Think unique computer configuration or warranties only sold bundled with a device, or unique database architectures. As a result, many products don't have a part number listed. So let's think about our solution. So we're trying to identify these different products. And it does sound like a classification problem. Can we just throw a large language model at not with 50 to 60 million classes, we can't overwhelm any system. Our solution is a series of joins under a variety of assumptions. So we're leveraging the bits of information that we have, so a handful of fields. So we're going to, and then once we've have potential overlaps, potential matches with between the enter data and the catalog data, that we will check the description overlap and also check to see that the product seems to be within a valid price range. So now we're going back to the 11 fields. These 11 fields within our data are over 20 million rows. We validate TDR transaction against GSA catalog. The catalog looks more or less like this, kind of like Home Depot, right? But Home Depot sells 1 million products. GSA sells 60 to 70 million, which is, so why is it 60 to 70 times the size of the large box stores? Well, GSA Advantage does have probably a wider variety of products, and they're all sold from different vendors. However, importantly, the catalog has items which seem to be duplicated, but they have the same title, same description, but they have a different part number. So this is one of the issues, is that we're relying upon vendors to input their information, input part numbers. And sometimes they have slight modifications on part numbers. Sometimes they have large modifications on part numbers. And you can also notice that these two different items have different green tags. So there's probably something deeper going on as far as what justifies them, and they have different prices considerably. So within the fields on TDR, we use contract number, manufacturer name, manufacturer part number, and unit of issue or unit of measure for identification purposes. What that looks like is this 6-part model, which is, or 7-part model, where we do different joins. So the method N0, we're using UEI, manufacturer part number, manufacturer name, and unit of issue. And we can see that we have a 43.2% match rate within the catalog. With because manufacturer name is oftentimes entered inconsistently, and this is due to many people not knowing the exact way to enter the manufacturer's name, since oftentimes people might abbreviate the name or they might not know the full name of the manufacturer, or they might not choose to input it correctly. So if we scratch out manufacturer name, we get match rate up to 52.8%. Now, vendors can have their own part number, which is different from the manufacturer part number, and for their internal consistency basis. And when the TDR first came out, we were trying to make it the least burdensome to the vendor, so we allowed them to enter either manufacturer part number or vendor part number. We've now moved towards manufacturer part number because the vendor part number created additional inconsistencies, but there is about 15.5% of the data which uses the vendor part number instead of the manufacturer part number. And then basically N3 and N4, rather than grab the manufacturer part number from the field part number, sometimes vendors, at least initially during the pilot, would enter the part number or in terms of manufacturer part number or vendor part number within the description field. So we're looking within the description field for those required fields. And then finally, maybe for some subset of the data, we basically, that doesn't have matches, we experiment with using the idea of allowing matches which are outside of the catalog, like it corresponds with each vendor. So let's say Home Depot is selling to the government. If they have an item listed that they sold and we don't see that it's in their catalog, well, maybe we can look at Lowe's, or so we look at across the entire catalog rather than just that within the vendor sales. And that's methods N5 and N6 using part numbers, either derived from manufacturer or vendor. When we have multiple potential matches, what we do is we initially choose the match which has the most description overlap. And then if the matches have similar or identical description overlaps, just if they have identical description overlaps, then we go with the method which has, which is the lowest ranked. In this case, we can see that N5 will be chosen above N1 in the first example. In the bottom example, N0 will be chosen above N1. Overall, combining the match rates, because many of these will be matched in multiple methods, we get just about an 80% identification. This might seem low, but there's a great deal of additional complexity in the data that we have not yet discussed. There's within the data, there's firm fixed price, labor hour services, alternative product listing mechanisms, such as like national stock numbers, bundled products, and customized products or solutions. So I'll briefly talk about how we verify that the prices are priced competitively. We've chosen we've looked at a few different methods. One's the mean plus or minus some scalar of the standard deviation. Another one's the median plus or minus the interquartile range. To large outliers. Sometimes the vendors would just incorrectly enter information, and rather than listing one unit, they might list for a large sale. Rather than listing 1,000 units for a large sale, they might just list one unit and then write in the description that there's 1,000 units. So that would completely throw off any means or standard deviations. And then the other issue with the mean standard deviation is that a large portion of the data is basically at the catalog price, which means that there's no variation whatsoever, and you don't have a standard deviation if you don't have any variance in your data. It's more or less the same issue with the interquartile range. What we ended up doing was having a median price, basically using a price ratio, which is the sale price over the median price of that product. And that allows kind of the conventional thought of like, oh, you can have a markup above or markdown below relative to the expected price. And then we looked at potential problems that way. Well, thank you very much for your time. There's so much more we could talk about, but yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you see and hear me?
We can see your slides and we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning. I'm George Ziff. I'm the Chief Statistician and Audits at the Office of Inspector General in the Department of Transportation. I'm pleased to be here and present this morning. The ideas in this presentation began with an audit where I was asked to take some geographic data and create a based on travel to some randomly selected sites. That's led to the development of some R functions, and which are now public, and also this presentation. So moving forward, I'm going to go through a review of how this works. We'll be walking through an example. I do not mean to present this as the only way of doing things, just an approach where we take into account distance and measure of size constraints. Again, we walk through the example. I'll link it to sample size and provide some references, and then obviously at the end of this session, take any questions. So geographic data, just some examples and some challenges. I imagine that when most of us think of geographic data, we think of the data published by our hosts, the U.S. Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which at whatever its level not all data meets these requirements. For example, if you had to group airports together or manufacturing facilities or business establishments, how would you go about that? In this presentation, I'll be taking a geographic approach, but the key thing here is that not all geographic data is contiguous in an obvious sense, and can be, you may have to put in some business rules on grouping them together. So just to give an example, this is a chart of 381 aviation manufacturing facilities. I'm masking the data a little here. It is public information, but I just am in the habit of masking things anyway. Some of these groupings are obvious. Like it seems that, the Seattle area jumps out at itself, in LA or Chicago. But what would you do with this area in here or in here? Particularly if you're, this presentation will have some operations focus. If you were to assign travel, how you group things and coordinate them with travel. is part of the challenge you'll face. So let me talk a bit about the package that contains functions on these. That is an R package called PracTools. I will assume that everybody has at least some familiarity with what R is, but at the high level, R is open source software which contains packages that generally contain groups of functions that aim towards a similar purpose. PracTools is an R package that provides functions to design and weight survey samples. It includes sample size calculation. It includes grouping geographic units, accounting for distances apart and measures of size. That's what we'll be talking about here. And also variance components for multi-stage designs. The first function we'll be going over is something called GeoDist PSU, which forms primary sampling units based on geographic distance. I'm going to walk through this just at a detailed level, just so that you can walk away knowing how to use this. But geographic data requires a latitude and a longitude for your unit. So if you have a tract or a county, you may want to use either the centroid of that or an arbitrarily selected latitude and longitude. For a state, you might pick state capital. It must be in decimal format. For our European colleagues or elsewhere in the world, you have a choice of miles or kilometers. But the next one is the maximum distance allowed within a PSU. And again, for us, we have real travel constraints. The travel budget is limited. So while we can send people out and they can travel to a number of facilities, those facilities have to be within a maximum distance. And then lastly, an ID field, if you have it, it helps with merging output later. So here again is our facilities. And here color-coded, and I've used default colors, is what it looks like when you have a maximum distance of 100 miles, how these group together. It's a clustering algorithm that uses the complete method, which guarantees the maximum distance from one within a cluster will be within a certain amount. And just to show it at a more detailed level, you can kind of see that these group together. This is how the clusters fall. These are the colored circles are all within 100 miles of each other. And this is easier to work with. One of the features that this does then is you can take understand. So previously we had all the facilities, but now you kind of have a sense of if you were to travel to places where you would be going to. Keep in mind, this does not include measure of size information. This simply just clusters the data. You also do get the maximum within PSU distance. You can see that we have a few that really do hit the 100-mile limit. If it's at 0, it means that there was only one element in the PSU. For example, Hawaii had one facility, and anything near Hawaii is certainly more than 100 miles away. So the Hawaiian example would be at 0. But this is a neat chart, and again, it gives you a sense of what you're looking at in terms of maximum distance. So again, the output of this is a data frame at the geographic unit level with the input ID if assigned, and then the PSU assigned to each input record. And that's just basically just straight up merging. But you also have a data frame at the PSU level with the number of secondary sampling units assigned to the PSU, the mean latitude, and the maximum within PSU distance. So this gives a lot of useful operational information and for planning purposes. Again, the complete linkage method is used to ensure maximum distance requirements are met. I'm going to talk a little, let me re-summarize the maximum distance and then talk about measure of size. Again, the genesis of this was very operational in nature, in that we can only go to so many places, how many facilities within a general unit can we go to is what drove that. From a survey design standpoint, though, if you're doing probability proportional to size, you'll want to have a measure of size variable. The measure of size variable is the variable used in a probability proportional to size sample design, PPS. I've given the formulas here. I don't think we need to go into them because I believe that the presentations will be available. And again, if you're doing a random sample, this isn't necessary. It does require some estimate of what your sample size will be, at least a preliminary sample size. And for those of you who are not that familiar with sampling, anything with an inclusion probability equal to 1 is automatically included. It's a certainty PSU census value. So here I've got the measure of size from what we had earlier, and you'll see there are, we have one certainty under the existing thing, and we haven't split it yet. So we haven't taken the measure of size into account. This is the distribution. In a perfect world, you have pretty even measure of size in your PSUs. So I'm going to talk about the second function here, which takes your geographic primary sampling units and splits them up based on a measure of size maximum or a threshold. And again, latitude, longitude, you'll need the PSU ID from your input cluster. You do need your preliminary sample size, the variable you're using, and your threshold value. All this, of course, is in the notes and documentation, and examples are provided in the documentation. But the key thing here is, what is your measure of size variable? What is your threshold for certainty between 0 and obviously 1 means it's necessarily in. Using this function and splitting things up, and I've chosen a threshold of 80, you'll notice that some of the certainties were successfully split. We still have one that at the unit level is so large it's going to be a certainty anyway. But I'm just going to toggle back and forth quickly, and you'll see a distribution that is much less skewed. So this is the original one. And just visually, you can see that there are a lot more here. There's still a tail, some skew to contend with, but a lot less than it was. You have a far more balanced survey design. By creating geography-based PSUs from geographic sampling units, two-stage design is likely, not necessary, but is likely. And there are functions in the practicals package that will help you design how many PSUs and how many secondary sampling units within those are ideal. That's outside the scope of this presentation here. Although I can take questions offline after the conference if you're interested. And so in summary, Practicals is a go-to package for me. I have to put in a good word for it. Disclaimer, I'm an author on the package. The GeoDist PSU can take sampling units and turn them into PSUs. The GeoDist MOS function can take the output from this and split them to make a more even sample design. And the output can be used to develop two-stage sample sizes. I didn't go into it, but if you have city and state, our package called Tidy Geocoder does an excellent job of providing latitude and longitude in decimal format. Go through it manually, always double check, because sometimes things can get a little squirrely in geocoding, but that's a helpful package. And lastly, much of this presentation is put into a vignette form. And I believe my email address is provided with the conference contents, and if it's not, please contact the coordinator and I'll make sure you get it. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, if that's not provided, you can always reach out to me and I can make sure that you get contact information. And so we are going to now move to our final speaker for our session, to Trevor.
Good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen. Guys, see everything.
I can see your screen. but you might be a little soft. See if you can turn your volume up.
Sorry, there we go. That should be better now. Apologies.
Much better.
Okay, awesome. So on improving CPI survey frames using administrative data. So first, a quick disclaimer. I'm going to be using probably some broad generalization of business names, and I just wanted to clarify that those businesses are not representative of the businesses listed in the CPI calculations. They're just examples, but with that said, let's get into it. So over the past year, you've probably heard a lot about inflation, and the CPI is probably the measure that you've seen in the news the most often. The CPI is a measure of average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. And since 2019, for most goods and services in that basket, the CPI uses data collected from the consumer expenditure surveys, which we also call the CE. Now, the CE is our primary frame source for stores. So a frame source is what we use as a data source to get a list of stores a diary and an interview. The diary is self-administered, with respondents keeping a diary for 2 one-week periods. And for the interview, each respondent is interviewed once per quarter for 4 consecutive quarters. When these are combined, they cover the entire consumer market basket. And from that data, we can calculate the CPI. So although the CE is a fantastic frame for stores for the CPI, there are some places where we would like to supplement it. And this is the case whenever you rely upon just one frame for data collection, as no single survey or data set is going to cover all of the data everywhere all at once. So in regard to where the CE surveys could be improved for us, in some items and service categories, they have a lower number of stores listed by respondents than what we would like. And another aspect is that the CE collects limited geographic data. And then finally, the CE surveys are based on respondents, and respondents sometimes input incorrect store names, human error. And one way to patch these issues is through one of these potential frame sources for stores is the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, or the QCEW. QCEW produces data on the number of establishments, monthly employment, and quarterly wages for workers. And microdata is made available to BLS programs through the Internally Managed Longitudinal Database, or LDB. As a result, there are more unique businesses and stores listed in the LDB than what is reported by respondents in the CE. And furthermore, since the LDB does not collect consumer responses, we would get a list of stores which would not be impacted by potential respondent error. Excuse me. However, there are some issues that make implementation of the LDB something that you need to be careful with before just jumping into it. So first, the LDB is a business registry, so it has no consumer data. And this means the LDB has no geographic information on its consumers. In the CE surveys, respondents can report stores in different CPI geographic areas from where they live. If a store is selected, prices contribute to price change in the respondent's area, but not the store's area. So in this regard, the LDB is best suited for item categories where consumers primarily purchase near home. Second, the LDB categorizes businesses by the store's primary North American Industry Classification Code, or NAICS code. However, categorization of NAICS codes do not concord perfectly with CPI item definitions. And since only one NAICS code is listed per store, it can be tough to see all of the industries a store might be a part of. So, for example, different department chain stores might have different primary NAICS codes for each outlet. A department chain might have some stores listed in the department stores industry, but some which sell a greater variety of goods might list their primary industry as the supercenters industry. And then third, the LDB does not clarify the customer base of its businesses. So in particular, the LDB, as mentioned, is a registry of businesses, and those businesses serve both consumers and other businesses. No data is provided to distinguish between businesses which sell to consumers and those which do not. And given that we are interested in consumer data, the ideal metric to discover what portion of an industry a business represents is consumer expenditures. Unfortunately, the LDB does not have consumer expenditure data. In the LDB, the metrics we could do to have some sort of measure of size would be employment count, wages, and the base number of stores belonging to each business in the industry that we're looking at. And of the three, employment count seems to have a very high correlation with consumer expenditures, and therefore, for this instance, we believe it makes a good proxy for measure of size. So with all that said, let's take a look at an example of a service which is a good match via our LDB research process. So first, we look at the categories that are the poorest performers. And these are categories which have the lowest number of stores listed by respondents relative to the number that we need to get. Once we have looked at poor performing categories, we also consider other categories which might need assistance. Some of these are categories with some respondent-induced error. Categories with respondent-induced error are categories where respondents frequently list incomplete names or where they list stores that do not actually sell the good or service in question. Second, we review the potential NAICS codes and see how their definition concords with CPI item or service definitions. And we also check to see if the item or service is frequently purchased near consumer homes and if it is likely to be sold to other major businesses. And finally, we review the data in the LDB to see if that data supports its implementation as a frame for stores. So first, we see which businesses are the biggest members of each respective industry based on employment count. We check to see if the businesses listed in the selected NAICS code sell the item or service as it is listed in the CPI, if they sell specifically to consumers, and if the number of stores listed is higher than what is listed in the CE surveys. We also check to see if the businesses listed in the CE are accounted for in the LDB. And finally, we limit to CPI geography. We do this since the CPI is a primarily urban-based sample, and we want to make sure we account for that distinction. So now that that's been said, let's take a look at the first of our two case studies. So this case study looks at using the LDB as a frame source to assist categories which have a or number of entries for the number of stores that we want. So our example will be the delivery services category, which in CPI is defined as the inclusion of fees for delivery of items such as letters, documents, and packages. In Table 1, we look at the number of stores reported by respondents versus how many we need for representativity. Delivery services had a much smaller value than what we needed, so we know that this is a category that could really use the help. We looked at historical data from the CPI's old frame source for stores from before the implementation of CE, and we calculated what portion of consumers purchased delivery services at stores near their home and what portion purchased it far away from home. The vast majority buy delivery services near their home, so the criteria fits. We also need to compare the description in CPI for delivery services with the potential NAICS industries which could be a frame. There are two NAICS industry codes which could work, 492.110 and 491.110. Of the two possible candidates, only one has the same top businesses that are listed in the CE and what the CPI has historically seen. And this is the couriers and express delivery services industry, NAICS code 492.110. And it's going to be a frame. So first, we download the LDB microdata and limit it to just CPI geography. It's important to limit to CPI geography since different businesses in more rural areas sometimes focus on different products than their metropolitan counterparts. Once we've done that, we need to find a way to make the hundreds of thousands of data points in the LDB actually readable and viewable within a normal human being's time constraints. And for this sake, we collapse the employment count for every single establishment in a big business, which are listed as having the same industry, into one entry. And, for example, one supercenter store might have 50 employees, but if we combine all of that business's stores together, there would actually be over 1,000 employees in the US. So we do this, and then we look at businesses with the largest share. And from there, we want to see what portion of the industry they account for. In the case of delivery services, the largest businesses made up over 90% of the total industry's employment count. 99.48% of those that we looked at sold specifically to consumers, and all of them sold delivery services. And finally, top businesses listed in CE are also listed in the LDB here, so the LDB is representative of our current sample as well. With the LDB, we got enough stores to be representative, and furthermore, for delivery services, the number of stores listed in the LDB was nearly 85 times as big as it was from just what respondents had listed. And this impressive result isn't just limited to delivery services, but to other categories. Veterinarian services and funeral services have both also been approved for the use of the LDB as a frame source for stores. And we saw similar results with them as well. Since these categories were structurally a good match, we overcame the LDB's shortcomings, hit home with its benefits, and improved the comprehensiveness of our data. So now let's take a look at our second case study. This case study looks at using the LDB as a frame source for stores to reduce error from respondents. This is the food away from home categories are what we're going to be looking at, and they're known to have a bit of respondent error. Food away from home is broken down into two components, the full and limited service categories. For something to be full service, you need to pay after you finish your meal. And for something to be limited, you need to pay before. Although this may seem clear-cut to us, there are factors which have caused some confusion for respondents, and some of these reasons are definitional. I think most people, if you pull them off the street and just talk to them, they would say fast food or sit-down restaurants, not full or limited service. So I think that sometimes they conflate these definitions, but there are some other issues here that aren't just definitional. So for example, limited service includes some traditional full service restaurants which also have dedicated takeout. So why is this concerning? Well, in an effort to account for respondent error, stores which are traditionally full service are removed during CPI's review process for limited service stores and vice versa. For outlets which aren't universally known, it can be harder to discern their official status. And if it's hard for us to get that info, it can be probably even harder for respondents to know. But there's even another level to this. So specifically during the pandemic, many restaurants which did not have dedicated takeout services briefly sold takeout almost exclusively. And respondents listed these restaurants as limited service. And this resulted in a decent amount of error. Please look at the table. So, notice that there are 3 rows, 1 row for full service, 1 for limited service and from expensive outlets, and 1 for limited service from cheaper outlets. Since there were over tens of thousands of data entries in limited service, we collapsed businesses down such that all the stores in a single fast food chain, for example, would be listed as one data entry that would show the number of restaurants, the number of employees, and the average wages in CPI areas. And second, for limited services, we wanted to account for the businesses which make up the most of the industry. And these would be cheaper businesses like coffee shop chains. And then also we looked at stores which are more likely to be included due to respondent error, which would be expensive outlets. And the idea here is that expensive outlets were usually one-off stores which were not large chains, and expensive restaurants were more likely to be incorrectly categorized full-service restaurants than cheap restaurants. When looking at the data in this table, you see respondent error at a pretty high rate. For full service restaurants, respondents incorrectly listed the outlet name 1 out of 8 times. For limited service, it was an estimate of 27%. And for those cheaper ones, it wasn't too bad. It was 3%. But overall, we see this category needs help. So let's see if it's a good fit for the LDB. For both full and limited service, most consumers historically purchased it near their home. So this fits our criteria. Second, there are specific NAICS industry codes for limited and full service restaurants. And finally, we know that most restaurants sell to consumers, so this shouldn't be an issue. But let's check the LDB data to make sure that's actually correct. Full service is a good fit. In fact, there is a specific industry, as I mentioned before, for full service restaurants. And all of the top businesses sold full service to consumers. Furthermore, all top businesses listed in CE are listed in the LDB as well, so it looks rather representative. But what about restaurants which sell full service meals and snacks, but which don't list full service restaurants as their primary industry? Well, there are actually 4 other industries which work pretty good, and these cover potential outlets which sell the item but do not list themselves as primarily being a full service restaurant. By broadening our reach, we get a better chance of not missing anything. And since these industries sell to consumers, and since they consistently have stores which sell full service meals and snacks, we should be good to go. Looking at limited service, the same result. All of the top businesses sold limited service meals and snacks to consumers. The top businesses in CE are also represented again, and the definition for limited service restaurants covers the CPI definition. And just as before, there are other industries which are quite successful. These industries often sell limited service even if it isn't their focus. And finally, this would be the comparison between our CE and LDB yield for each. The number of stores wasn't an initial issue here, but the increased comprehensiveness is an added benefit. And actually, finally, here's our comparison of store identification. Using the LDB, the portion of wrong stores would be significantly less. We also increased the number of stores in our sample, meaning we can get an even more representative idea of prices. In conclusion, the CE surveys, they've been absolutely fantastic, and we want to keep on using them. However, there are some places that we would like to supplement the data, and the LDB is one fantastic supplement. By choosing categories which are a good match, we can overcome the LDB's shortcomings, hit home with its benefits, and in doing so, we can improve the comprehensiveness of our data, reduce respondent error, and hopefully improve our measure of the CPI. So thank you so much for listening, and special thanks to the cost weights and special projects section, as well as Ben Hoke and Carrie McNair, who provided me data on full service restaurants. And here's my contact information, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Let's give all of our speakers a hand. We appreciate them all being here, and these were all really excellent talks. We only have about 3 minutes, and so I'm hoping if we have any questions, we can get them either typed up really quickly or raise your hand. I'm going to go ahead and read the couple that we have in the chat already. It looks like George already answered the question. So it looks like the questions that we have are David's, and there's 2 of them. So the first one is what response options were given for the gender identity questions, and some Paradata doesn't have response options in it, so you may not have that information, but I think you could probably address it at least.
Yeah, so I think I addressed that during the talk. I showed the response options on screen pretty quickly after I received that question. The other one I got was, how do I divorce the cognitive burden in income questions from sensitivity when comparing to SOGI, especially time spent on the question? It's hard to know whether, time burden is a result of sensitivity versus cognitive burden, though one thing that has been done is changing how income is asked. So theoretically, if you ask income with categorical response options instead of asking for like a point estimate, that should reduce the cognitive error without it might be a little bit less sensitive in that respect, but that's one way to do it, but I don't think it's completely certain that that's what's being done. Thank you for your question.
Okay, do we have any other questions? If you would like to raise your hand, you can ask a verbal question or you can put it in the chat. So I have a question sort of about time, and I'm going to ask both of you in the Paradata work to sort of think about this. That what does time sort of mean in Paradata? This is something I've struggled with. Is long time better? Is short time better? Is it something where you need to think about like how long it takes to read the question, each individual question? Like, how do you really think about time rather than these big aggregate measures in ways to be useful in Paradata?
Sure. Yeah, I can take a quick shot at that. I definitely think it's a complicated topic and kind of can change between different types of surveys. Or just in using the CE example, like Trevor mentioned, we have 2 different surveys. Like for our interview survey, that's we prefer to be at lower times, and less burden on our respondents. But on the diary, since it's more towards self-administered, you would hope that that's representing people actually being engaged with the diary and entering more expenses, like actually interacting with our help menus and little tip features and stuff to actually fill it out as completely as possible. But I also think part of it's how you end up defining the time spent in diary. Like I kind of mentioned, there's issues if you just sort of take the whole session time, how long are people just like stepping away and being idle. So yeah, kind of how you define it, like in our case, trying to get it like actual time spent diary keeping or entering expenses. Like for us, yeah, a little bit more time is better, but yeah, it's definitely can vary from survey to survey, I think. But I hope that was in some way helpful, not just ramblings. But
okay, I think we are going to have to wrap up because we're at time. But you should be able to reach out to the presenters if you have additional questions. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, and we'll end our session so we can move on to others. Bye, everybody.
Have a nice day, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
yeah, thanks everyone.